Well, hello and welcome to the Speakeasy. My name is Paul Feasy, and tonight I'm joined by
and Glen Scrivener. Hello.
Hello. Good to have you guys back. It's been a few weeks, hasn't it, since we were all together.
Yeah. So
right?
I've been on a few different missions over the last month, but I've been in Northern Ireland. So yeah, in Coleraine on the north coast, lovely part of the world.
And what were you doing there? Obviously a mission, but
yeah,
a little bit more.
12 churches together in Coleraine on the north coast of Ireland. They still remember the 1859 revival there, and we had a mission that was less successful than the 1859 revival, but still very worth doing. And saw people trusting in Jesus, and it was a great time.
Cool, good, yes. And was it 2 weeks ago that we were doing the Disney Speakeasy? It feels like longer, doesn't it?
On the House of Mouse, and we had a conversation about the gigantic corporation that is Disney.
Yeah, and it's been a while because we weren't here last week. It's bank holiday. Were you in Coleraine for the bank holiday, or was you?
I was, yeah, and then I came back on the Monday to catch the end of Bible by the Beach, which is kind of like Keswick on the south coast.
So you were at Bible by the Beach, is that right?
I was.
And so what's Bible by the Beach? Well, it's Keswick on the south coast, but can you tell us a little bit more about it?
It's a bit like New Word Live.
Which is
like new wine, but not in a tent.
Spring harvest.
Yeah. It's one of those things where
it's like Woodstock for Christians.
Not really,
but in Eastbourne.
Yeah.
It's quite self-explanatory, really. It's Bible by the beach.
There's a beach.
What's not to get, Paul?
We'll go.
Although a lot of people think it's Bible on the beach. In fact, when Rico Tice came to speak about 5 years ago, I met him at the station and sort of walked him in, and he was like, "So where's the marquee?" And he was expecting us to be on the beach, but it's actually in the Congress Theatre.
Yeah. So that was a good weekend, and lots of our interns and people were involved with that as well, weren't they? Kind of serving on that sort of conference. But there's another conference coming up this weekend. Is that right?
Yes.
And are you all going?
Yeah.
Thank you.
On the theme of conferences, there is the Unbelievable Conference. Unbelievable. Which was the sting that used to be used on the Unbelievable podcast and radio show that Justin Briley hosts. Unbelievable, which is a brilliant impression. If you know what I'm talking about. But,
and so all you guys are going. I think all the interns are going, and you're going. I didn't get invited, but that's fine. Okay.
Would you like to go?
Whatever. That's fine. But you're actually, so people are going as delegates, right? But you're actually doing something up front. Is that right?
Up front, I'm speaking to the theme of God Unmuted, but Justin Briley has given me the topic, how do we transcend the culture wars? So very fractious, splintered political atmosphere. Society is sort of coming apart at the seams. Nobody knows who to trust. How do we engage with the culture wars? And in particular, Justin's given me the topic of how to transcend the culture wars. So already, as he put that out on Twitter, that's become controversial. It's become a kind of fodder for the culture wars. Are we in a culture war? How do we engage the culture wars? Is transcending the culture war even what we're meant to be doing? So we'll be getting into all that on Saturday, but we thought we'd do a dry run tonight.
Great. We got a few people watching in, which is great. Good to have you with us. Are we okay for sound here? Because a few people have said Nate's mic doesn't appear to be either working or is very quiet.
It's not switched on.
Just be good. There we go.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nate Morganlock, and I'm joining you on the Speakeasy this evening.
Nice to have you, Nate.
There we go. So we're talking about the culture wars then. So you said that Justin's tweet about transcending the culture wars caused a bit of a stir. Why has it caused a stir? Is that because people feel very strongly that we shouldn't be transcending them? We should be wading in, or how's it?
We should be waging them. We should be starting the culture wars. Like we should be invading small sovereign nations next to us. We should be Putin online, basically. Is well, it's okay. So Tim Keller, New York pastor in Manhattan, planted Redeemer Presbyterian Church in 1989. I think he began in his front room in one of those stories, and it grew to a congregation of about 5,000 these days, and lots of different congregations across Manhattan. Best-selling New York Times best-selling author, and he tweeted out about 2 weeks ago on how we engage the culture and politics, and he mentioned the issue of abortion, and he was kind of talking about different ways of being pro-life, I think charitably to read through the tweet thread, but it triggered a lot of people who saw him as kind of placating the left. And there have been quite a number of accusations about Tim Keller that he only nudges people to the left of him and he punches people to the right of him. And there are people who are saying, look, we live in a very polarized society in which people have the sense that the culture is out for Christians, and those on the left in particular are out for Christians, and you need to pick a side, and you need to cut it with all the winsomeness, and instead you need to engage the culture robustly. And the subtext, which is very rarely said out loud, but the subtext is you need to engage from the right in that discussion. That's rarely said, but it's more than implied, I think.
Yeah.
If people are kind of complaining that he's only nudging left and punching right, we need to do a different thing. We need to wade into the culture wars, pick a side, and fight for our survival, sort of thing. And that tends to be what people have been saying over the last week or so online.
And then obviously I think the thread that you mentioned came out before the leak of the Supreme Court's ruling on Roe versus Wade, and so that obviously has reignited the conversation around abortion, and kind of off the back of that, Keller's tweets and things have been sort of reassessed, I suppose. So there was a guy by the name of, I think it's James Woods, who then wrote an article on First Things in which he said, look, I'm a huge Tim Keller fan, have been for a very long time. My dog is named after him. I think it's just Keller rather than Dr. Timothy Keller,
Timothy J.
which is a strange name for a dog. But he said, look, I feel as though Keller was right for a time. This cultural engagement model was okay for a period of time, but the political moment has changed and we need a new operating system, or we need a new way to engage with things. And so thank you, Keller, but we need to move on.
And he talks about evolving past Tim Keller, which is an admission that because the political cultural movement has changed, we need to change too. Which is interesting because I think that's often the accusation that's laid at the door of, liberal Christians. They are progressing with the times. They are being led by the cultural shifts, and therefore it's the shoe's on the other foot at that stage. I think if the tactic now is being led by, we're in what's being called a negative world rather than a neutral world.
Yeah. So that's a reference to Aaron Wren, who'd written similarly on this First Things website, and he talks about these three stages that have taken place in the secularization of America, and he talks about the positive world. I mean, I don't think he's using world as in the entire world. He's particularly thinking about the United States, and he says that pre-1994 American public life was positive towards Christianity generally. Between 1994 and 2014, he says we stepped into the neutral world. And then since 2014, we've now flipped over into what he calls a negative world. And then he identifies this sort of religious right movement, the moral majority, people like Jerry Falwell or Francis Schaeffer, who were part of the American religious right through the 70s and 80s, and who were kind of very kind of vocal about preserving a sense of Christian morality in America. He said that worked up till a certain point, and then it was kind of taken over by a seeker-sensitive movement, so people still able to engage with the world around them, evangelize the people in their communities. And then when we shifted into the neutral world, Keller and his model of cultural engagement, obviously centered and focused in on Manhattan, was the thing for the times. But then things have shifted. And so I think the fundamental question is, have there been shifts? Is Aaron Wren correct when he identifies those as the eras? Is one question, but are there shifts in culture which need to be taken seriously by the church as we think about engaging with the world around us? I think that's the fundamental question for me, because if he's right on that, then I think you've got this issue of, okay, so how is the church supposed to operate if the circumstances are different?
Yeah, but it's also a sense of like, what is our horizon? What's the sort of the time scale we're working on? Because I think David French, in his sort of Sunday article, sort of spoke about the early church and, you know, the world of the New Testament, in which pretty negative, you know.
Yeah.
And when Nero was, you know, lighting up Christians as part of the entertainment at his parties, that's quite the negative world. And yet Paul still writes Romans 12 to them and says, you know, vengeance is the Lord, he will repay, and let's, you know, repay evil with good. And so I don't know, I find it odd to think just narrowly in terms of, well, since Trump, the world is like this. And you're like, wow, I don't know, since the year of our Lord, you know, 2022 years ago, I think those are the kind of epochs we need to be speaking in. And we don't live in as negative a world as, for instance, Peter was in when he wrote 1 Peter. And, you know, he was not talking about joining the culture wars of his day. He was talking about something quite different in terms of, you know, we are the priesthood. We are the royal priesthood. We are the chosen nation. Let's build church as this alternative counterculture, which again, you know, sounds a lot like Tim Keller, which is, okay, it's a third way thing, which is not halfway between left and right. It's above, it's off to the side. It's a weird thing. And I just fear that with so many, you know, you can take issue with some of the things Tim Keller has tweeted recently, and I do, but to then use that as the occasion for saying, okay, let us now abandon the option of a third way. Let us now abandon trying to be a distinct counterculture, and let us throw our lot in with one side. I think that would be a big mistake.
So I suppose the great thing, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, as you unpack for us what you've called the Abram option. One great thing is that clearly Scripture speaks to us throughout the ages and around the world. And so there is the word of the Lord that stands, even though everything changes and the shifting shadows. However, there is clearly a very distinctive, there is a great distinction between the early church before Constantine, after Constantine, the church around the world, and America as this slightly, you know, exceptional country, which is founded on all sorts of, you know, vaguely sort of Christian principles, although you've got obviously separation of church and state, and then the cultural shifts that happen within America itself. And so I suppose the challenge is trying to say, well, what is the wisdom, the scriptural wisdom we need, which is going to see us through all those different stages and all those different approaches. And another question is, what is the issue for Christians in the public square as public servants, as those who are involved in journalism or other forms of media or politics themselves? And what's the role of the church as the church, and those kind of questions?
And another shift, I think, in history is the shift towards democracy, in which all of us are enfranchised. We all get a say. No, you know, nobody was electing Nero as Caesar, and yet we do get a say in who rules over us. And so there's a duty as a citizen to participate in decision making at that level. So we've all been drawn into the political arena in a way that the early church wasn't. But also social media has drawn us in. You know, it's not compulsory. You don't have to be on Twitter. But the dopamine rush is huge. So we are all now, if you're on social media, we're all like setting out our platform and giving our little press conferences on a daily basis. And we're all now feeling like we've got to contribute at that level of
Mm.
political discourse, which
Yeah.
I think is very unhealthy.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, maybe before we get onto the Abram option, and there's a little video for us to watch, I think, on that. Thinking about the impact of social media,
Mm.
and another fantastic article from Jonathan Haidt looking at I forget the exact title again, but it's looking at the impact of social media decisions that were made in the 2010s.
Mm.
And it's an absolutely fabulous article because he takes the Tower of Babel and he says, when you look at what happens in the aftermath of the Tower of Babel, is that the people are sort of confused and separated and unable to communicate. And that the Lord's doing, because they've attempted to create this single sort of place to build this tower to heaven, and so the Lord comes down and confuses their plans. He says that decisions that were made by social media giants in the 2010s have created this sense of absolute disintegration and inability to understand one another, the inability to communicate, and algorithms which reward outrage and encourage polarization.
Yes.
And the gathering of all sorts of complex issues into one single side.
Yeah.
And so you sign up for one, you sign up for them all.
Yes. And we'll show you the worst example of your opponents, Yeah. And of course, Jonathan Haidt's very good at talking about our confirmation bias. We will let slide all the worst examples on our own side, and we will fixate entirely on the worst examples of the other side. So that polarization just happens all the time. It's really unhealthy. And it is all for the outrage clicks. And so I think part of our strategy for engaging the world will increasingly involve detaching from the outrage machine and just talking to our neighbors again, because, my neighbor knows nothing about any of this stuff and is dealing with issues that are at a very familial, local level. And I think, again, local church really is the hope for the world. And I think there is an increased opportunity for that as people have tried to invest in the detached kind of global, we've gotten upset about things that are happening a world away in a place where we'll never visit. And we've gotten very upset about that. And we don't know the names of our neighbors, and I think there's an opportunity for churches to kind of become more those local, embodied, healthier communities that are just, because Twitter is not real life, and real life is worth engaging with.
That Jonathan Haidt article was Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid, which is a very catchy title. We popped that down in the comments for people to have a look at. It's from on theatlantic.com is where it was. Nate mentioned then this Abram option.
I said Abraham, and I got in trouble with Glenn. He said, no, it's Abram.
Yeah. Oh, of Avram. I believe. Yeah. Aleph, and then Beit.
So what do we mean by this then?
Should we have a look at a video where I basically unpack for 2 minutes what happens in Genesis 14? If you want to navigate through the culture wars, of course, the first place you turn is Genesis 14. So should we have a look at that video, and then I'll try to explain some more. Here is the setting for Genesis 14. This is the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf. So we've got the Med, the Red, and the Dead. Up here would be modern-day Turkey, then Iraq, Iran, the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, and the promised land of Canaan. The first thing we hear is of kings of the north, the king of Shinar, of Elasa, then there's King Kedorlaomer of Elam, he's the big daddy, and the king of Goyim. They moved down under the leadership of Kedorlaomer to oppress the 5 kings gathered around the Dead Sea. That's Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. So it's 4 kings versus 5 kings. This is the first time that kings are mentioned in the Bible and the first time war is mentioned, and those two things are very much linked. Kings are powers, and these powers clash. It's not goodies versus baddies here, it's just power versus power. Now, after 12 years, the 5 kings rebel against the 4 kings, but their rebellion is unsuccessful, and the 4 kings carry off the people and the goods of the 5 kings, including Lot, who was now living in Sodom. But then we learn about Abram. He is not called a king. He's not interested in cities and wars and power plays, even though his household contains thousands, and he can raise up an army at short notice. Abram is different. He comes up out of Egypt in order to live in tents, not in cities, because he is looking forward to a city with foundations whose maker and builder is God. Abram is called a Hebrew, which means one from beyond. He raises an army of 318 soldiers from his household. He runs off the 4 kings from the land. He retrieves Lot and his whole household. He brings everyone back to the only king that brings peace. That is Melchizedek, which means king of peace. So it's not about the 4 kings or the 5 kings. It's not about cities or worldly power plays. It's about being a true Hebrew, someone from beyond, who builds up the household of faith and points the whole world to the King of Peace. So there it is, Genesis 14. And, so it's the first time that the Bible mentions kings, and it's the first time that the Bible mentions war, and those two things are very linked. And it's the first time the Bible mentions the word Hebrew, which is what Avram is. He is a Hebrew. He is one from beyond. And it's what foreigners used to call the Israelites because they were from beyond the river. And so the nations looked on at Israel and just said, they are out of this world. They are like, where are these guys from? They are from beyond. They are these Hebrews. And Abraham is doing, Avram is doing something. Let's just call him Abraham. Okay, Abe. He is doing something so different. He is pitching his tent. He's not investing in the city because he's, according to Hebrews 11, looking towards the city with foundations whose maker and builder is God. And he's just dealing with the household of faith while the kings are dealing with their cities and their warfare. Now, he does engage with the culture, and he engages with the culture when Lot is in trouble. And so when the family is about to be taken down, then Abraham, let's call him Abraham, picks a side. And okay, in this season, he stands shoulder to shoulder with the king of Sodom and those other 5 kings against the 4 kings. And he manages to raise an army of 318 soldiers. So that makes you see that his household is thousands strong. He could have called himself a king, but he's not into that. He could have built a city. He's not into that. But he does raise a household that can handle itself in the battles of this world. With the 318, he runs them off the land. He reclaims Lot, but instantly he drops the king of Sodom, and instantly he's just not interested in the king of Sodom. He wants to bring those kings towards Melchizedek, who is the king of peace, who brings out bread and wine. So there's one king who is a king of peace, Melchizedek, who I think is the pre-incarnate Christ, who is also a type of Christ. We can get into that another day, but here is this king of peace, your one shot at peace, who actually has a feast rather than is engaging in the warfare. And instantly, Abraham does not want to be made rich by Sodom, and he doesn't want to make them rich. He doesn't want to depend on them. He doesn't want to be dependent upon them. And so this is kind of a model that in a brief instant, for some reasons, you can engage with the wars that are raging. And actually, you should be training up your family of faith to be able to do that, but don't make alliances with the 5 kings or the 4 kings. And then in Genesis 15, it's fascinating that Abraham, he's got the spoil from this victory, but he's downcast because he has no seed. And then the word of the Lord comes and says, I'll give you, seed like the stars in the heavens. And he believes the Lord, that the Lord will bring about a massive household of faith. And it's counted to him as righteousness. And then he goes into a sleep, and the Lord tells him, look, the seed of Abraham, your seed will go down into Egypt and come back up again. And it will, it will take over the world. It will have great plunder in that. And so he's not told at that point, fight against the Egyptians when they come after you. He is promised, centuries of suffering and then glory, because he's going to go the way of Jesus, the way of the cross. And so I think Genesis 14 and 15 are a fascinating kind of test case in what the family of faith is meant to do. And they are meant to not simply take a side in the wars that are raging. Sometimes it is necessary for them to fight.
Mhm.
And he does that on that one-off basis. He then detaches himself and wants to bring everything towards the King of Peace. So that's the Abram option.
Sounds a bit like the Kenny Rogers song,
Okay.
"Coward of the County." Do you know that one? Do you know that
I'm
one?
not familiar. Can you
So-
sing a little bit for us?
Come on.
I'm not a great singer, but yes, the refrain is, "You don't have to fight to be a man." That's all the way through in the chorus, and then finally, after this, coward of the county's beloved has been taken over by the, I can't remember who these terrible men are, but they come and attack, and then the final refrain is, "Sometimes you have to fight to be a man."
There you go.
And so it's
Yeah,
this kind
yeah.
of son having, sort of speaking to his father about, this, when is it right to fight? How do you know when to do it? But I think your point about this is a temporary alliance made at a particular time because you have to do that, but you're not losing sight of that primary goal, which is to build the household of faith and to bring people to the King of Peace. And yeah, I think it's a very compelling approach, and I suppose it reminds me a little bit of, and it'd be good to hear you kind of talk through the differences here, but it reminds me a little bit of a book that came out, I think it was about 2016, by Rod Dreher, called The Benedict Option. Do you want to just tell us, so as far as I can tell, that was about creating within the household of faith institutions which would be marked as Christian, and for those to sort of provide a place within which the household of faith can be developed and nurtured and educated and grown. And it's almost it's not quite a state within the state, but it's allowing the church to develop the institutions which it has a great history of doing within the West already, because those institutions have maybe been lost to a kind of secular army. How is the Avram option a different way, would you think, than the Benedict option?
There's a lot of overlap, and I've chosen the option language as an homage to Rod Dreher, who is Eastern Orthodox, and so he's going back to St. Benedict, who kind of founded the monastery, the monastic movement. And really, that was a response to cultural collapse in 410. The Visigoths kind of sack Rome, and it's the end of everything. Augustine pens the City of God, and obviously there's the Augustinian orders of monks as well. So there is that movement to withdraw from the city, and originally, it's to go out into the wilderness. And to be alone. The monachos were those who were alone, and they became known as the monks. Over time, they end up going back into and forming these communes and having a kind of a rule, like the rule of St. Benedict, and they end up forming these communities that end up having hospitals and showing great care and charity towards the communities. So it's interesting. Andy Crouch was noticing, he's a sort of cultural commentator and exceptional author. He said, from the Protestant side of things, he noticed how lots of people were sort of dunking on Rod Dreher's Benedict option as a kind of a retreat, a cultural retreat from the Great Commission. And he said, well, it's interesting that like the great majority of the Benedict option as a book is trying to convince you that there's something like the fall of Rome in 410 has happened, that there is a cultural collapse that is happening, and he's right about that, isn't he? Says Andy Crouch. What are we going to do about that? So it is interesting about time frames and different tactics depending on different time frames. But I think where I differ from Rod Dreher is I think the more Eastern Orthodox sense of missiology is to say the mission of God is the church. And so let the church simply be the church, and that is the mission of God. And in a sense, I disagree with that only in terms of emphasis, because I think the church is the mission of God, but in a much more sort of evangelical sense, that the mission of God, that the church is inherently missional, and that in order to be this household of faith together, we are constantly pointing the kings of, Sodom and Gomorrah and Zoar, and we're constantly pointing them to the great high priest Melchizedek, and that there is a very much an evangelistic thrust to this, which I don't think Rod Dreher would massively disagree with. But I think the evangelical sense of missiology is that church is missional, whereas I think his more orthodox sense is that the mission is the church, kind of thing. You might end up getting to the same place, actually, by pursuing both those kinds of visions. But I would still say it's still an outgoing thing, the Abraham option, because you're still pointing to the great Melchizedek. It's just you're pointing to him in quite a different way to the ways in which the 4 kings and the 5 kings are engaging. You're not waging a culture war. You're building a counterculture.
Do we want to have a look at some of the comments that people have been chipping in with?
There's some great comments.
Lots of good stuff coming in. I think the guys over on the desk are going to point us to some of them.
Tom Clowes said a pretty funny one. He said, "When I get into culture stuff, I wonder if I end up sounding like a Christian Alan Partridge."
That suggests.
What would that sound like?
It suggests that Alan Partridge isn't Christian, whereas I think Glen's book would reveal that you can't have Alan Partridge without the Jesus revolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alan said he was on God's side. I hate the devil. It's bang out of order. So.
Alan would identify as a Christian, don't you think?
Oh,
yes,
undoubtedly. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure he was baptized in Norwich somewhere. Yeah, I'm sure that's what he would say.
Charles Ray McNinch had a few good ones. This one in particular, he said, "Christianity is relational, and so is being human. It's way less complicated than we think. To bloom where we are planted is to be ethical and principled in relationship to a proper understanding of who Jesus is and what he accomplished in history."
Charles Ray McNinch.
It's a good phrase, isn't it? Bloom where you're planted.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what if you're planted on Twitter and you have to engage with all of the things that people are saying all over the world?
Yeah. Except you really
all of the time.
You just don't. You don't. There's that video that you and I made, Paul, from years ago, like three top tips of how to engage with social media.
Oh yeah.
And number 1 was you don't need to post something. You just don't. You don't need to comment.
Just don't post.
Just don't post anything. Yeah. And then put somewhere in your bio that you're Christian, and then don't be a jerk.
Follower of the way.
Follower of the way. Part 1 to the Nazarene.
So here's the question. What about the formative influence? So even if you're not posting, even if you've got somewhere in your bio that you're a Christian, even if you're not actively being a jerk, if you are consuming so much stuff which is just saying the left, the right, the left, the right, the left, the right, you're actually being formed and trained in those that binary of every issue must be a war issue.
Yeah.
And I think that's where even people who aren't engaging with things online, we are consuming it, and therefore we're being formed by it.
Which means if I get half an hour of a sermon on a Sunday, that's one kind of formation. But if my feed is just full of the owning the libs, or the horrors of the right, it's not good for your soul. And therefore, to use the horticultural kind of analogy, you do need to do some weeding out and some muting and some unfollowing. And there are lots of great people to follow online. There really are. And there's lots of spiritual nourishment and encouragement that's being offered online. But you've got to be so discerning, and I think you've got to do a lot of weeding. Yeah.
Any other comments you want to point us to, or good for now?
Charles Ray McNinch had a few other ones. When he was talking about, you guys were talking about the role of the church earlier. He said the role of the church is that of the new humanity. quote unquote, sharing the gospel correctly, which is primarily historically baptizing and loving others according to the Jesus model, is the plan until Christ returns in every generation.
Mm-hmm. The new humanity, and exactly. I think Tim Keller's whole thing was the prodigal God. That's his sort of classic work in terms of humanity leans towards either younger brother-ish kind of humanity or elder brother-ish kind of humanity. And Christ is the new humanity. He's the father who's not like the elder brother, and he's not like the younger brother. And I think that is so helpful. What's also been pointed out is that these days the left is not simply a younger brother wanting license. That the left is also very censorious and authoritarian. And so some of that model is a much more messy thing than it had been in the past. And yet the point still remains that there is a third way. There is another kind of humanity that is not like the left, and it's not like the right. And we need to really cultivate that and work on this counterculture. The other thing I'd really love to say is, I think some of this debate that's happening online is on whether we should be winsome or not. And I think absolutely we should be Christian online. And none of what we say and none of the heat of the cultural moment excuses unchristian behavior, but that does not mean that we can't be forthright, and it doesn't mean that at times we might provoke backlash and very very negative reactions. But so it's not really about. And I don't think Tim Keller is saying that we need to be winsome all the time, i.e., we need to make friends with all people all the time. It's just that I think when we offer critique of one side, we also ought to offer critique of our side, let's say, or those who are closest to us. And I think it's on the kind of the model of 1 Peter 4 verse 17 that judgment begins with the household of God. And Peter is picking up this massive biblical theme in which the prophets are always pointing at the nations, and they're saying Assyria is terrible and Moab is dreadful and Philistia is awful, and we are the worst. And what I would hate to see is that we don't want the winsomeness of Tim Keller, and so we just go to oracles against other nations. And I'm not saying, hey, enough of the oracles, guys. Let's just be kind to each other. What I want to see is, if you're going to offer oracles against the other side, will you also offer oracles against those who are closer to you? Because I think there's plenty of blame to go around left and right. So it's not about being winsome. It's not about being just kind. I think you can be robust. I think Abraham raised 318 soldiers who could really handle themselves. But it's just being aware that if you happen to lean left, there are plenty of people on your own side that you can call out. And if you happen to lean right, there are plenty of people on your own side who you can call out if that's what you want to do. Ultimately, what you want to do is look up and point people to the King of Peace. But it's not just about being a pacifist. It's not just being about being a neutral. I don't believe in spiritual neutrality. And that's why it's not about simply retreating to a safe space. It's about building a household of faith and trusting that God will make our family of faith like the stars in the sky. And so we don't need to engage out of fear and out of anxiety. And I just see a lot of people engaging out of fear. To engage out of fear is really to take the side of those who you are fearing. And we're called beyond that. We're called to look to the promises of God. And Jesus was absolutely not anxious about the success of his movement. He was just like yeast working through a batch of dough. It will happen. Like a mustard seed that's going to be the greatest plant on earth. It'll happen. The church will grow, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So let's not engage out of a sense of pearl clutching or out of a sense of deep and profound anxiety about the success of the Jesus movement, because that is not in doubt.
Micah, did you want to throw?
Yeah, there's
something else
a
as well?
few more that might be of interest. Patricia Mooney is pointing us towards Acts 17:11. Does anyone know that by heart?
Acts
Paul of
17:11.
the Areopagus.
Here we are. I got it here.
Oh, no.
With the Bereans.
Now the
Bereans
Berean Jews
before.
were of more noble
Okay.
character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true.
So that's Paul kind of opening himself up to critique
Mhm.
from the scriptures. So the apostle who wrote half the New Testament is like, yeah, just test what I say, test what I say against the scriptures. And so, you know, let none of us say, well, if Tim Keller said it, must be true.
Mhm.
Or whoever your spiritual,
Yeah.
you know, acolyte might be, you know.
And actually, that's a really interesting thing. To what if in your engagement on any of these issues, it ends up in a Bible study, and it doesn't end up in I will just throw some verses in and use a whole bunch of other stuff. But we say, no, okay, you mention a verse, okay, let's sit down and look at that, because that's where wisdom is found.
Yeah.
It's not just found in sort of vague cultural comment or engagement.
Yes. Patricia has followed up with her own comment. Micah, what does she say?
Yeah, she says, I don't think we can afford to have any quote unquote gurus, basically celebrity preachers and authors who are trusted because of who they are. Take what is Acts 17:11, compliant, throw away the rest of their commentaries.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, I don't think Tim Keller or any of the people we've spoken about would disagree with that. But yeah, with Bibles open, let's receive what we can receive, and let's test it all.
But I don't think she's saying that only people who've written commentaries on Acts. I think she's saying we should.
Yeah, maybe
whole of
the whole
Scripture.
Bible. I
the
think.
whole of
Yeah.
Bible.
Do we have
Thank you.
time for one more?
Yeah.
Yeah,
quick.
sure.
Yeah, Joe Byrne basically sums up maybe his experience of what we're talking about here, because says, I saw an interesting post the other day that summed up the culture wars about historical or lefty Jesus versus colonizer, right-leaning Jesus. What was interesting is that both had things that were just plain wrong, others that were trying to make things about Jesus mutually exclusive that just aren't.
Mm-hmm. And the culture wars are thoroughly theological, completely theological, and there is the sense that on left and right we are just hurling Bible verses at one another. We've just forgotten the references, so that even positions that are taken that are diametrically opposed to what the Bible would advocate, people have to advance those positions in Christian garb. You know, they've got to paint sin in virtue's colors, and the virtue that those sins are painted in are very Christian in the ways that they're kind of presented. But yeah, we live in the world that Jesus built, and we are responsible for the culture wars, right? We've exported them to the world, so like we can't complain. We are the ones who are most fiery in our condemnations of the heretic and the blasphemer, and we excommunicate people, and we started it, and the world is carrying it on by political means. But it's really helpful to see how very Jesus-ish both the left and the right is, even if you disagree with you know what they're saying. So on something like the pro-life issue, I think I am 1000% pro-life. I find it fascinating that the pro-choice argument has to be put forward in terms of healthcare, female empowerment, bodily autonomy, right? The equalization of the sexes, reproductive justice. All those things are like fundamentally have all those notions and all those highest values that people have fundamentally been given to us by the Jesus Revolution. And there is something that the pro-choice advocate is tapping into that is trying to present things in terms of some very Christian-ish values. Of course, they're forgetting the humanity of the unborn and failing to accord those rights and that justice to the unborn. But even as we do something as abhorrent as killing a million babies a week in the womb, we these days do it for the sake of compassion. Or we present it as a compassionate thing, which and that's sort of Christianity kind of infecting all the culture wars. Yeah.
Guys, lots of helpful things there. Hopefully people at home have found that useful as well. Do keep commenting down below, even if you're watching this after the event. Let us know what you think, and we might pick up on that again next week when we look at the comments. Nate, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Foundry and what the Foundry
I
is?
would love to. So the Foundry is the Speak Life School of Creative Evangelism. And we basically have developed it so that we can train people in engaging with a theology for life and mission, and engaging with the stories to win the world, helping people think through exactly the kind of issues that we're discussing on the Speakeasy, but also looking deeply into the stories that are being told, and how to engage with those, and how to study those as Christians, and to point to the true story, the actual story. So we've got the Foundry. There are 3 parts to it. There is the Year Out, which is where you come down for 10 months to Eastbourne and help us run this. And remember to turn Nate's mic on. Sorry,
Because Nate
bit
can't
of a
do it
dig.
himself.
I just can't be trusted to do it myself. So helping us with that, and helping us sort of get this show on the road. So that's the Year Out. We also have the Foundry Unlocked, which is an opportunity on Fridays for people to mostly Zoom in, so they can join us online, and to think through the things that I sort of mentioned: theology for life and mission, and stories to win the world. And then the Foundry Intensives, which are a real highlight every term that we do them. So 4 times a year, we have people come to the Speak Life studios to come here and to get using the microphones and the lights and the cameras, and think about how we communicate. What does that look like? Whether we're preachers, or we're sort of running communications and media for a church, or we're involved, just interested in these things. So there's 3 ways for people to get involved, and I believe we have a short video, which I don't come across very well in this, but I must say you don't realize just quite how irritating Thomas can be. I'm joking, of course. Let's roll the VT.
Hi, welcome to Speak Life. Speak Life exists to use creativity to share the Christian message. Want to look inside? Hi, it's Thomas. Sorry, I forgot my key. This is the cutting edge of Speak Life, the Foundry. Do you know what a foundry is? I didn't either. It's where metal is melted, because that's kind of what goes on here in a metaphorical sense. You will learn all the key elements of video production, including shooting, lighting, editing, sound. What else is there? The second key aspect of the Foundry is theological. When you join us here, you will partake in the Foundry Unlocked sessions, which happen on Fridays, and also 4 intensive weeks throughout the year. These will give you a theology of life and mission, and a theology of creativity. What's your favourite food?
My favourite food?
Yeah. See you in a bit. If you come here, you will get to work with the wonderful Matir. During your time here, we will support you as you develop your own creative portfolio of projects. You will have access to the senior and technical members of the Speak Life team, and your training will be supervised by Nate Morgan-Locke, who is the Speak Life Development Director. You'll even have the opportunity to go on missions around the country, maybe even around the world, with Glen Scrivener or Nate Morgan-Locke. Where are we going, Nate?
I'm just going to get some milk, Thomas. I didn't actually ask you to come with me.
Oh. Well, I'll come anyway. No, actually, yeah, I've just remembered. I'll see you in a bit. Thank you. Well, we would love to welcome you here at Speak Life on the South Coast, the Sunshine Coast. So called because it gets more sunshine than any other part of Britain, I think. I once was lost, but now am Foundry.
So don't be fooled by the deadline on there, because the deadline has now changed. What is there a deadline anymore?
Just come.
Just
Just
come.
Just
Just
hurry.
come.
Hurry
Hurry up.
now
yeah.
while stocks last.
And how can people apply for this, Glenn?
They can go to speaklifefoundry.com. That's speaklifefoundry.com.
Brilliant. Okay. And so we've got the intensives. Actually, we've got one next week.
That's right.
Is it too late to sign up for those if people want to come? Or
Oh, I would have thought in the next 48 hours.
If you're quick.
let us
If you're
know.
quick, yeah,
You
come.
can be here next week.
Wouldn't that be
That'd
amazing?
be good, wouldn't it? Have you with
But
us?
yeah, and you can be here in September. Come and join us for 10 months. We'd love that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Great, guys. Thanks so much for the conversation tonight. It's been really good. Hope you folks at home have enjoyed it. And yeah, we will catch you all again next week. That's all, folks.
See ya.